Wanted to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet virtually today, the many lands that we're across, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So I'll introduce our two presenters and then I'll take a back seat and get to learn along with all of you. So we've got Patrick Ferry, who is the Assistant Manager, State Manager of our Victoria Office of the National Archives of Australia. And he's a professional archivist and local historian. In 2020, he won a Victorian State History Award for Best Local History Project. And his co-presenter is Janin Greer, the great-granddaughter of the subject matter of this webinar, Florence Winter Irving. Janin has a passion for family history and storytelling. She is the custodian of many of the family photographs, letters and documents in today's presentation. So thank you for sharing those with us. And Patrick and Janin have co-authored a historical note based on this webinar published in the December 2021 edition of the Victorian Historical Journal. The layout of this will be a presentation by our two presenters, and then you can ask you'll notice that your cameras and microphones are off. If you'd like to ask any question, just feel free to type it in the chat, and then there'll be time for them to answer questions at the end. So I'll throw to you guys.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I'm just going to share the presentation. You seeing that now?
Yep, got it.
All right, so I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people as the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm speaking today, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging as well. Look, I'm very excited to be presenting this webinar today with Janin. It's a great story, and it's a story that's very appropriate for Women's History Month. Because what we're going to do is look at the story of a Melbourne woman who married a Turkish diplomat, but we set that against the backdrop of how women were treated in terms of their citizenship and their nationality. And Janin and I are going to pass the baton between each other throughout the presentation. But I thought I'd just start to set the scene, and we're going to go back to London in September 1913, and a wealthy young society woman from a stately country mansion meets a handsome, debonair diplomat from the Turkish embassy in London. Now, some of you might be fans of Downton Abbey, and it certainly sounds like a plot line from that hit British period drama. But it's actually the real life story of Melbourne socialite Florence Winter Irving and Hussein Shefik Bey Muftizadeh. And their story today, which we're going to tell, is documented in records held by the National Archives of Australia, contemporary newspaper reports and memorabilia, family and traditions that have been treasured by Florence and Shefik's descendants. So let's just introduce the main characters for our story, and I'll start with Florence herself. She was the youngest of 11 children, born to a wealthy Victorian squatter family. Her parents were the Honourable William Winter Irving and his wife, Frances Amelia Taylor. Now, the Winter Irving family, their fortune was actually made by Florence's grandfather, Jock Winter. And he was an enterprising Scottish butcher who became one of the early settlers of Victoria. His wife, Jane, was the daughter of the chief of the Scottish clan Irving. And in Victoria, Jock acquired a pastoral run near Ballarat, and he subsequently made a fortune during the gold rush. And that fortune was then invested in more land. In terms of Florence's parents, her father, William Winter Irving, he was responsible for consolidating and extending those family fortunes. And eventually the Winter Irving family held around 250,000 acres of grazing land in Victoria, as well as millions of acres of pastoral leases in Queensland. And William was able to translate his family's newly acquired fortune into both political influence and social advancement. Variously, William served as a Shire President, a magistrate, and as a member of the Victorian Legislative Council. was also a member of the very exclusive Melbourne Club. Descended from the Scottish clan Irving, he even managed to get himself listed amongst the pedigreed in Burke's colonial landed gentry. Now, Florence's mother was also the daughter of a landholder. Her father was William Drayton Taylor of Narylem near Murchison. Now, William himself became widely known as the Laird of Narylem. That's because he built a palatial Italianate mansion on land that he acquired from his father-in-law. And that mansion was set on 2,500 acres, including park-like gardens and a long tree-lined carriageway. And Narylem was regarded as one of the finest homes ever built in colonial Victoria. Just to give you some perspective, these are some photographs of Narylem from the State Library of Victoria collection. You can see it's an extremely grand property, one that would have cost an absolute fortune to build. Now, Florence herself, she had an upbringing, education and lifestyle that was consciously based on that of the British upper class. She entered Melbourne high society in 1903 after making her debut at a government house a debutante's ball. And after that, her social life was a glittering round of balls, recitals, bridge parties, polo gymkhanas, horse races, charity events, and even the occasional palm reading. Florence, with her mother and sisters, used to host events at the family's townhouse in the suburb of Armidale. And we're not talking about a little place here. We're talking about a large mansion, which was also called Narylem, and it even boasted its own ballroom. Now, who attended Florence's events and what she wore was also widely reported upon in the social columns of Melbourne's newspapers. Now, Florence's father, William, died in 1901, and she actually received an allowance from the estate. And that enabled her, for example, to travel overseas extensively with both her mother and her sisters. I'm going to throw over to, just before I throw over to Jeanette. Final thing just to note with Florence is that she and her siblings were all expected to make suitable marriages. Of Florence's sisters, the eldest, Frances, married into the Anglo-Irish landed gentry. 3 other sisters married into other Victorian squatter families. In some respects, Florence's favourite sister, Laura, hit the jackpot in the sense that she actually married a German baron. But Florence was unwed well into her late 20s, and she actually feared that she was destined to remain a spinster nursing her widowed mother through old age. But Florence's future was about to change in a most spectacular and sensational manner. Over to you, Janan.
Hello everyone, my name's Janan Greer, and as Patrick mentioned, I'm Florence's great-granddaughter, and my name, Janan, is a Turkish name, hence the Turkish connection. And as Patrick mentioned, Florence was the youngest daughter of 11 children. So she had a mother who had lost her husband, and she was, quite frankly, as family history tells it, she was terrified of becoming a nursemaid to her mother and being a spinster for the rest of her life. So her nearest sister in age, Laura, was at the time living in Germany with her German husband that Patrick mentioned earlier. And Florence's younger brother, Cyril, agreed to accompany her to Europe for, in those days, what was coined a grand tour. Now, that was 1910. Florence and Cyril set off together. He is her chaperone, and they spent a lot of time in London, and she visiting her sister Laura in Germany. It was in London that she was introduced to my great-grandfather, Shefik Bey Muftizadeh. That's a significantly long name. Back in those days, Ottoman people didn't have surnames, so he was just referred to as Shefik Bey. and apparently they met at a dinner party, and Florence was quite the conversationalist. And from everything that I can gather about her, she was pretty gregarious and quite the talker. And so given her sister's marriage to a German baron and her schoolgirl French, French was Sheffick's mother tongue, they were able to converse and fell madly in love. Next slide, please, Patrick. So a little bit about Sheffick, my great-grandfather. He came from a long line of Ottoman diplomats. His father was Reshid Pasha, and Pashas were ministers and notorieties within the Ottoman government and regime. And his father, Reshid Pasha, had been the ambassador to Rome. He'd spent a lot of time in Europe, and he was to end up in his last posting as the Ottoman ambassador to London. Sheffick, his son, his middle son, was also involved in diplomatic affairs. And he'd been positioned at the embassy in London, and he was working in the embassy at the time that he met Florence over in the UK. That's a photograph of Sheffick with relatives and family members. And I think one of the things to note is that Florence had this very affluent upbringing, and in Ottoman terms, Sheffick's family was also very affluent, having owned properties on the Bosphorus and this particular home on Prince's Island in Istanbul. So if you'd like to move to the next slide, please. This is just some photographs that we have in our collection of Sheffick, who is the little boy seated on the left there, with his elder brother and younger brother and their father, Reshid Pasha. So you can see that these are gentlemen who dress in very debonair garments, who are very much affiliated in the Western way of living. Although Reshid Pasha certainly had diplomatic uniform and quite a lot of pomp and ceremony attached to his position, for the main, they were very Western, I guess you'd say, in the way that they grew up. And Sheffick spent most of his youth in Rome, some time in Istanbul, and then later in life, time in France and the UK. Reshid Pasha's brother was Zia Pasha, and he was ambassador to the United States of America. And this photograph, we believe, was taken in his office in Washington, DC. So it's a family with a very proud diplomatic history. So Florence and Sheffick met, and they had this whirlwind romance. And I think it's fair to say Florence had been in the United Kingdom for 3 years by the time they met. And there's significant correspondence from her mother to her brother Cyril talking about Florence's lifestyle in London and the fact that she was spending too much money. She was really whooping it up, for want of a better word. And Cyril, it seems, was very well aware of the fact that she was involved with this Turkish man. And they married in secret. So they married at the Ottoman embassy in London with their marriage formalised at the registry office in St Marylebone. And news of the marriage soon hit Australia and the UK with notices published in the press. It was definitely the talk of the town at the time. Florence didn't tell her mother immediately of the marriage, and it seems that Florence was forced to cable news of the wedding to her mother after it had hit the papers. You can see that Melbourne girl marries a Turk, married to a Turk. And then this concept of entering a harem, which was very much a product of the misinformation and misconceptions of the time. There was certainly talk that she was going to enter a harem and be lost forever. So these articles are documented the 2nd of October, and in letters we understand that her mother wasn't notified until the 6th of October. So there was definitely a lag. And it's fair to say Florence's mother, my great-great-grandmother, was not at all happy about this news. In those days, very much a lot of misinformation around foreign cultures, and particularly the exotic Middle East. It's very difficult to read that handwriting, which is very scratchy. So Patrick's moved to the next slide, where she learns of Florence's wedding, and you can see she's very dramatic. You cabled the marriage to me. It's nearly killed me. Why did you let her do such a dreadful thing? She's ruined all her life. I don't think the marriage will be happy. Don't let her go to Turkey, as once she's put into a harem, she'll never get out and we'll never be able to trace her. Surely this must have been going on for some time. And if I'd been cabled to, I would have come home. And interesting that they call England home, not even Australia in those days, or sent someone to save her. And she says, oh, I know nothing of this man and I'm suffering agonies. And then the reference to him being a Muslim, I suppose he's a Mohammedan, a dreadful disgrace. And then she's saying, but don't be angry with her, as it will only make her more determined. And do all you can to help her, Cyril, for dear father's sake, son dear. And I blame myself for letting her stay away so long. So her mother is absolutely up in arms, and there's further correspondence that says, oh, it was bad enough that Laura married a German, but Florence has really taken the cake for her marriage to a Turk. So you can see why Florence was quite timid in terms of sharing the news with her family. Next slide, please, Patrick. And so upon her marriage, she becomes Madam Shefik Bey. And in the process, she loses her nationality and becomes an enemy alien. And this is where I think, Patrick, you pick up.
Thank you, Janan. So, yes, with a very privileged upbringing, social skills and graces, including, as Janan said, fluency in French, Florence was able to transition relatively seamlessly, it seems, into the pre-war European diplomatic circuit. And the fact that the grandfather had been a Scottish butcher was no longer an insurmountable social barrier, since many members of Europe's old nobility were keen to co-opt new money into their ranks. But as Janan said, there was a little sting in the tail in all of this, in that through her marriage, Florence didn't just acquire Shefik's name, title, and diplomatic immunity. Legally, she was also deemed to have acquired his Turkish nationality and automatically forfeited her British nationality. Now, today, gender equality is a fundamental part of the democratic beliefs and rights that underpin Australian citizenship. But back in 1913, Australians were British subjects, and British law determined that a married woman's nationality followed that of her husband. And this was a legal embodiment of patriarchal views about the status of women. Now, women's groups in Australia at the time Florence was marrying Shefik were actually campaigning for equal rights in terms of their nationality. And this appeal that I've got on the screen here, this comes from the National Archival Collection. It's addressed to Billy Hughes, and it's signed by Vida Goldstein, one of the early prominent feminists in Australia. Now, we don't know if Florence was aware that she would lose her nationality, or even if she cared. She was clearly in love with Shefik, and he had a very promising career ahead of him. So, she perhaps would have assumed that the future would be assured, prominent, even gilded. And I think it's important to note here that Florence had also demonstrated great strength of character in going against both her family's wishes and the prejudices of Australian society. However, a little less than a year after the marriage, war breaks out in Europe. And it's not long before Turkey is dragged into the conflict on Germany's side. And there's a total change of attitude towards Turkey as a whole. Turkey becomes the enemy. And you can see these are some newspaper stories about the declaration of war and the image of the Turks now, the fiendish Turks, the unspeakable Turks. Now, Florence, after the war's declared, the social columnists in Melbourne start wondering, well, what actually happened to Florence? This particular article here has come from the Perth Daily News, and it talks about 2 or 3 years ago, a pretty and clever Melbourne girl, Miss Florence Winter Irving, created a sensation by marrying a handsome young Turk. Her people, wealthy Victorian society folk, were not altogether pleased. However, one wonders where the young couple is now and how affected they are by the war. So what had actually happened to Florence was she was now legally an enemy alien. And she actually literally ended up behind enemy lines. Shefik is sent back to Constantinople initially, and then he's posted to the Ottoman embassy in Berlin. And it's in the midst of Berlin, the capital of the Central Powers, that Florence gives birth to the couple's only child, Reshid. And Reshid's there with his mother at a very young age. Now, it's interesting that Florence is in the middle of Berlin because being Australian born, she would be normally regarded by the Germans as well as being an enemy alien. But of course, she's protected in Berlin by Shefik's diplomatic immunity. Now, she remains in Berlin until 1917 when Shefik is then posted to neutral Switzerland. Now, her loss of British nationality in the context of war, as I said, means she's an enemy alien, and it actually has some very tangible impacts for her. So, for example, she's actually prevented from receiving any money from the Winter Irving estate back here in Australia, because for the family to send her money would be regarded as trading with the enemy. And their Florence's sister Laura finds herself in a similar situation. I think it's interesting to note at this point too that there was still money for Florence to receive. Even though her family were extremely upset, you know, the mother was absolutely distraught by this marriage, they don't seem to have actually disowned her. And so there was money piling up in Australia that she was not allowed to receive as an enemy alien. Now, Florence does receive at the sum of £8,000, which is a veritable fortune, in late 1918, early 1919, but that's only after the armistice, the end of the First World War. But Turkey's status as an enemy of the British Empire means that even as late as 1924, she's having her solicitors petition the Prime Minister, Stanley Melbourne Bruce, to get more funds released from her trust funds in Australia. The fact that she could get her lawyers to approach the Prime Minister, Stanley Melbourne Bruce, directly does indicate the social prestige and influence that the Winter Irving family still had in Australia. The other thing that being an enemy alien during the war meant for Florence was that she was never able to see her mother again. And her mother became very ill in 1917. And she was effectively expected to die. And the family wrote to the army saying, you know, many of her children are overseas. She had 3 sons by this stage serving overseas with the military. And of course, there were 3 sisters living overseas. And the family wrote to the military asking for one of the sons, Stanhope, who was a decorated aviator. He was serving in the Middle East with the Australian Flying Corps and won the Military Cross. The family asked the military, could he be sent back to Australia for some furlough, so that he could be with his mother when he died. Again, it's a sign of the influence of the Winter Irving family that Stanhope is actually released from the army and comes back to Australia. I can't imagine many other people being released from trenches and things like that for those sorts of circumstances. But of course, Florence's mother dies, and Florence wasn't able to be there as an enemy alien. We're going to have a look at Florence's life now after the war. So I'm going to throw back to Janan at this point. You're on mute, Janan.
Oh, sorry. These years seem to be a little bit grey in terms of where they were and exactly what they were doing. Florence is there pictured on the left and her sister Laura is there on the right. And what we do know is that one of Laura's brothers actually travelled across from Australia to get her out of Germany and over to England. But Florence didn't have such good fortune. And so they spent time in Berlin, as Patrick mentioned, we think in France, and then in Switzerland. And the sisters were reunited in Switzerland in 1919 in Territet, which is on Lake Léman. And Florence and her husband Shefik and their young son Reshid, my grandfather, were living there then. Interestingly, Florence had a very difficult birth with my grandfather. He was born in the Ottoman embassy in Berlin, and he was given to a wet nurse for breastfeeding back in those days. And the wet nurse had tuberculosis. And my grandfather also appeared to have signs of TB himself. So at this point in time, they're living in Switzerland and she's reunited with her sister. Next slide, please, Patrick. And you can see that Laura, her sister, there's Florence there, Laura's young daughter, Florence, named after her aunt, and some of Shefik's family there with them in that photo in Switzerland as well. This is a photograph that was taken in their flat or apartment in Territet. And you can see that Florence is there gazing at a portrait, which was actually painted by my pastel painted by my great-grandfather Shefik. In between diplomatic duties, he was a very passionate hobby artist, and he did these beautiful, beautiful pastel drawings. And there she is gazing wistfully at the pastel that he's drawn of their son. And I might get Patrick to pick up from here, but by 1921, they're able to return to London on a diplomatic passport.
Thank you, Janan. So as Janan said, the family were in Switzerland for a period at the end of the First World War. At one point, Shefik, though, is transferred back to Constantinople, but he leaves Florence and Reshid behind in Switzerland. And that was very prudent because in the aftermath of this First World War, Turkey descended into utter chaos. The Allied powers occupied large parts of the country and were trying to carve it up. Ethnic conflict was breaking out between different groups. Power was also slipping away from the Sultan in Constantinople, with a rival government being set up in Ankara by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And in the midst of all of this turmoil, Shefik's father, Reshid Pasha, was again sent to London, this time to try and negotiate better terms from the Allies. Shefik was also posted to London as the first secretary at the embassy. So they had to go back to London and reopen the Ottoman embassy. There hadn't been an Ottoman diplomatic presence in London since 1914. And the document on the screen here, this generated a lot of excitement amongst our access examination team when they came across it on one of our files. It's the original diplomatic passport that the family travelled to London on. You can see it's in French and in Arabic. The Arabic insignia next to Florence's picture is the cartouche of the Sultan himself. So they were travelling on the service of the Ottoman Sultan at this point.
And Patrick, it's interesting to note that this year is the 100th year of the Turkish Republic. So Ataturk coming to power officially.
Yes. So one of the things that was quite exciting about looking at this passport was through the visa stamps, we were able to track the journey of the family. And it's very clear from the stamps that they travelled on the famous Orient Express to London. As I said, one of the things they had to do was reopen the Ottoman Embassy, a grand building in Portland Place. This comes out of Janan's family collection, but it's an envelope addressed to Reshid Pasha at the embassy. And Reshid Pasha was able to lay groundwork for a more lenient treaty. However, in 1923, as Janan mentioned, or at the end of 1922, I think actually, the Sultan was overthrown and replaced by a Republican nationalist government led by Ataturk. And one of the things that the Ataturk government did was dismiss the Sultan's emissaries from their various diplomatic posts across Europe. Shefik remained at the London embassy for a while, but then he was transferred to Switzerland. And this is from the same file that we have in our custody, but it's the diplomatic passport that was issued to Florence and her son Reshid by the new government. You can see it's Au nom de République Turque. It's issued in the name of the Turkish Republic now. Shefik continued to serve with the diplomatic service for a while, but in 1926 he resigned. And part of the reason that he would have resigned was that in some respects his family was very closely connected with the old regime. And that, of course, would not have endeared him to the new Republican leadership. He was also of Albanian heritage, and that may well not have fitted so well with a more nationalist order. But according to family tradition, the real reason that he and Reshid Pasha before him fell foul of the new government was that it was because they were married to foreign women. And certainly a few years later, Ataturk passed a law which actually banned government officials from having foreign wives and then applied that law retrospectively. So Shefik jumped in many respects, perhaps before he was pushed. And the family go into basically exile, and I'll throw over to Janan to talk a little bit about that next period of exile.
So the family were very disillusioned with the new regime, and they'd had much of their status, their possessions, their wealth stripped from them as a result. We have documents that exist in our family that indicate that their properties were seized in Turkey. And really without an income and the lifestyle that they'd become accustomed to as diplomats, they floundered. And they had very, very little money. So this is Reshid Pasha in Switzerland, and his health and fortunes are flailing at this time. And there's talk that he sold stones from his Pasha's insignia ring to pay for medical treatment at the time. That was how destitute they'd become. So they were very much isolated, unable to go back to Turkey, and in exile. And over this period, Reshid and his family, this is my great-great-grandfather, Shefik and Florence, they spent time in Switzerland and in Paris as well. And you can see at this time through writings of my great-grandfather that he was really disillusioned. He's written some sort of, I guess you'd say, philosophical poems or articles where he's calling out for a change in the system and change in the government, and he seems very disillusioned by all of the people that are in power at this time. And they planned at this stage to apparently visit Australia in 1925. But for whatever reason, they never came. And it's interesting because I know that they were very, very poor. Even with Florence's inheritance that she received, which was a stipend of sorts, they didn't have enough money. And my grandfather used to tell stories of them raiding his money box for money to buy cigarettes back in the day. And one of Rashid's, Florence's sister Laura apparently was supporting the family in an apartment or a flat in Paris that she owned. So I suspect they never came to Australia because they simply couldn't afford to. And this is them as emigres in Paris. And I actually think the photo on the left was potentially taken before even potentially the war, because my great-grandmother looks very glamorous and quite young in that photograph. But the one on the right is an interesting photo. It shows my grandfather with his father, Shefik, in Nice in France, and the gentleman sitting with them is actually the Ottoman Prince Osman Fuad, who was the Sultan's next in line to the throne. So it just indicated that they stayed in touch with their Ottoman diplomatic connections and contacts, despite being in exile. So, Patrick, you might like to talk about what was happening back in Australia and other parts of the world.
So during this time, women's groups continue to campaign for equal nationality rights for married women. They pointed to new American citizenship laws, which acknowledged that a woman's right to retain her own nationality remained irrespective of her marital status. One of the problems, though, that feminists came up against was that any change to the nationality laws was actually an imperial matter, and it needed agreement not just from Australia, but also the United Kingdom and other dominions such as Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. And that agreement was not actually forthcoming. So the Australian government, though, found a compromise position, and in 1936 they amended our Nationality Act to at least enable married women who had lost their British nationality through marriage to retain their rights within Australia. So that meant that within Australia, even though they'd lost their nationality, they could still vote, they could claim a pension, those sorts of things. But Australian women who'd lost their nationality, when they travelled overseas, they could not travel on a British passport and they'd still be regarded as aliens outside of Australia. Over to Janan for the family's move to London.
Yes, so between Rashid, or Shefik rather, leaving the diplomatic corps and then moving back to London, he'd had a few stabs at other professions. He and his brother tried to set up a broking business, but that all went terribly pear-shaped during stock market crashes. And they did find themselves back in London in the 1930s. And by this stage, my grandfather, who you can see there as a young man with his mother, he had been given some money that had been left to him by his grandmother, Frances Amelia. And so he decided that he was going to come out to Australia at this point to learn more about his Australian roots. So in 1937, he set sail to Australia. And in a strange twist of fate, lightning struck twice. So he met my beautiful grandmother, Judy, And my grandmother, Judy, there is pictured at her debutante ball at the age of 17, and they met at the ball and fell madly in love with each other. And she used to always tell me that she thought my grandfather looked like Omar Sharif. He was so exotic, so debonair, and just so incredibly handsome. But Judy, like Florence, was also from a squattocracy family, the Churnside family. The Churnsides were Scottish migrants who'd come out to Australia and made it good based on wool and the land. And they were not at all happy about Judy being involved with Reshid. And her grandmother took her on this grand tour herself to try and distract the couple and prevent them from having a long and united relationship. But it didn't deter them. And at the time, Reshid ended up travelling back to Europe, and they had these secret rendezvous in various ports that family friends had facilitated for them. So they were absolutely determined to be together, and Judy's family eventually acquiesced when they threatened to elope. So while Judy and Reshid are having their romance, Florence returns to Australia in January 1939, and she returns to Australia not realising at the time that she's terribly unwell. She comes back to Australia and very soon after is diagnosed with mouth cancer. And a lot of the photographs back in the day show them smoking cigarettes. And it's fair to say that the cigarettes were the culprit for all of the cancer that they ended up dying from at this point. But Patrick, you might want to talk to the fact about her incoming passenger documentation.
Yeah, thanks, Janan. So they arrived by sea. So in our collection, the National Archival collection, there's the incoming passenger lists. But very interestingly is the statement or the declaration card that Florence had to make when she arrived, just as we do today. When we arrive on a jetliner, we fill in a little card. Florence had to do this in 1939. And she's actually listed now her nationality as being Albanian. So she's travelled into Australia on an Albanian passport. And that was actually questioned by the Australian government. And Reshid provided an answer to the forerunner of ASIO, and he said that we travelled to Australia on an Albanian passport, which his father Shefik had obtained, as he did not want to travel to Turkey to swear an oath of allegiance to the Republican government. Now, Janan had the other side of the equation, which was Florence's certificate of naturalisation from Albania. And when looking at it, it was very interesting. When she acquired her Albanian nationality, she took the liberty of shaving 11 years off her life, as you may well do if you have that opportunity. The other interesting thing just to note about the Albanian connection is at this time, Albania is ruled by a very colourful king called King Zog. And King Zog, like Shefik, was actually a former Turkish bey. But he'd managed to claw his way to the top and had himself proclaimed king, and he ruled in Albania until the Italians invaded in 1939. I'm going to throw back to Janan for the continuation of the romance.
Yes, so at this point, Florence's son Reshid is engaged to Judith Churnside. My grandmother lived on a property called Carambalik in Skipton in the Western Districts of Victoria. And again, a lot of this narrative is all about the sort of exoticism of marrying a Turk, but there's no mention of a harem by this stage, which is encouraging. And Florence applies to retain her nationality rights under the amended Commonwealth Nationality Act. So you can see that she's actually applied to become recognised as a British citizen, I believe, or an Australian citizen, Patrick.
That's correct. And in support of her application, it's noted that, for example, she was a member of a family closely identified with Australian pastoral and commercial interests. And she was also said to be British in her, quote, outlook and sympathies. That application that she made to retain those rights in Australia had to go all the way to the Minister of the Interior to approve. And that was registered and approved in late 1939. But as Janan mentioned earlier, by this stage, Florence is actually dying and she's actually only got weeks to live.
And so she shares news of her throat cancer with her son, my grandfather, Reshid. And I have this letter in my possession, and it's a very sad letter. She doesn't have the courage to tell him face to face that she's unwell. So she has this surgery to take out some of the cancer, but clearly it doesn't work. And I think the lovely thing about this letter is she says, imagine me not talking, can you believe it? So clearly she was a very gregarious and social person. And then she says that Dad has been angelic and so patient and touchingly kind to me. So you can see that there's still this very genuine affection between Florence and her husband, Shefik, who by this stage has come to Australia to be with her. And she died on the 9th of December 1939, and you can see her obituaries there in the Age and the Argus. And then, was it a happy marriage? I think that's one of the things I was keen to understand after Patrick brought this story to me and we started delving deeper. And my grandfather himself talks about their connection in a publication that he wrote about painting, and he said, my parents had one strong point in common, an unswerving loyalty to each other. Their lives had moments of glamour, but the changing world situation and the fact that they couldn't seem to adapt forced them to pass through a never-ending period of anxiety. They could only cling to each other, try to protect me, and stare horrified as life took its relentless course. So I think that they were definitely each other's port in a storm, but I don't think that the life that they thought was going to unfold did. And there was certainly a lot of anxiety over money and lifestyle throughout their entire life together. So Reshid and Judy did get married in Australia in May 1941. And it was the grand society events that Florence and Shefik were never able to have. And there were relatives from the Winter Irving clan there and relatives from Judy's family there, and Reshid's father, Shefik, was still alive and well, and he was there as well. So that's a photo of Judy's parents and Shefik there on the right after Florence's death.
Now, unlike Florence, Judy actually did not lose her nationality upon marriage because Reshid had the good sense to get himself naturalised as a British subject beforehand. And this comes off Reshid's naturalisation file in the National Archival Collection. And family connections in Australia again came to bear. And this is a letter from James Fairbairn, who was the Minister for Air in the Australian government at the time. And he writes to the Minister of the Interior saying, my uncle, Sir George Fairbairn, asked me this morning whether I could do anything to expedite the application of one Reshid Bey for naturalisation. So the Fairbairns, again, another very prominent Victorian squatter family, very well connected politically and socially, coming in to help try to influence the speed at which the application is processed. Now, Reshid went on to become an extremely talented artist. He'd studied art in London, and he continued those studies in Melbourne. Indeed, at one stage, he did a part-time course in figure painting under Sir William Dargie at the National Gallery of Victoria. And in the 40s and into the 50s, Reshid had a number of commercial exhibitions. And over the years, he had several paintings actually shortlisted for the Archibald Prize, the first being in 1951. The little newspaper clipping there from the Argus is just a write-up of a joint exhibition that Reshid actually put on with his father, Shefik. And Shefik was becoming quite well known in Melbourne for painting portraits. And Reshid went in for a range of different genres, including still lifes, landscapes, and also portraiture himself. This little photograph is a photograph of a Reshid painting that I've actually acquired. It's in my home. I'm very proud to have a painting by an Archibald Prize finalist sitting on my wall, but it's a lovely painting of a ruin in the south of France. By the late 1960s, Judy and Reshid had established an art school, and they actually toured Europe quite extensively in the late 60s and early 70s painting, and this painting came from their time in the south of France. Now, as Janan mentioned earlier, Shefik came to Australia while Florence was dying, and he actually never left. He stayed in Australia. And in the late 1940s, the nationality laws were changed again. The then Immigration Minister, Arthur Caldwell, being one of the driving forces. And those changes actually, for the first time, established the concept of Australian citizenship. So when Reshid was naturalised when Shefik was naturalised in 1949, he actually became a British subject and an Australian citizen. And in the process, he renounced any residual legal or official allegiance to Turkey in the process. So ironically, he dies in 1950 with his wife's nationality. The other thing just to point out is that those reforms of the nationality laws which Arthur Caldwell presided over actually did grant women equality of citizenship with men. So there was a provision in the new Act which enabled women to retain their own British nationality upon marriage. There was also another provision in it that enabled women such as Florence, who had lost their nationality, to actually have it restored fully. So, had Florence lived a little bit longer, another 10 years or so, she would have actually regained her full British nationality rights.